I was at a wellness center recently for a gathering, and a woman stood up in the audience, and she was talking to our group about the experience that she'd just gone through the activity that we were doing that really touched her. She was getting kind of emotional, and she began crying. And I'm sitting a few rows behind her, and as she's speaking, I noticed the woman sitting next to her is looking really agitated. She's looking all around, and finally she eyes a box of Kleenex, and she grabs the box, and she pulls out all these tissues, and she reaches up with this huge wad, and she wipes the woman's face for her. And of course, the woman speaking is slightly stunned. She pauses for a second, and then she goes on speaking as the woman next to her sits down satisfied. And I'm watching all of this go down, and I think to myself, all right, intentions, good. Delivery, not so good. See, I think social change, especially international development, is actually often delivered in much the same way. We think we know what people want, and then we go about imposing ourselves unintentionally, but through an unconscious desire to fix or make things better. Or we try to compel people with sticks and carrots to comply with what we think should happen, and then we get disillusioned or frustrated when our efforts are neither sustainable nor appreciated. But we never look at our own role in the process or ask what really people need. What I think we need is to reinvent the way we go about global change in a way that's more mindful. So today I'd like to talk with you about what I call conscious social change. This is an approach led by individuals who invest in their own sense of self-awareness while simultaneously striving to create positive change for the common good, mindfully and compassionately. I'm going to walk us through 5 principles that will help define conscious social change, as well as give you 5 guiding questions that can help you in learning how to practice it. Our first principle is to cultivate presence. And our guiding question here is, what is happening now? When you bring full attention to what is happening within and outside of yourself simultaneously, we call that becoming fully present. And this is a form of mindfulness. Now, science is starting to prove what wisdom traditions have known through their own direct experience for hundreds of years. A 2011 meta-analysis of psychotherapeutic research found evidence for all of these different benefits of mindfulness. Just 3 I'll point out that are relevant today include increased positive emotions, decreased emotional reactivity, and decreased stress. Now, why is this important to us? Well, because we spend most of our time on automatic pilot. And it's the quality of our attention that defines the quality of our relationships and our engagement with the world. Now, let me tell you a little bit about what this looks like. Global Grassroots, the organization that I founded, looks for change agents in some of the most marginalized communities of post-conflict Africa. We run what we call the Academy for Conscious Change, which supports women in particular with mind-body trauma healing, conscious leadership practices like we're talking about today, and a social entrepreneurship incubator, which helps these women create nonprofits that will serve other women and girls within their communities. So one of the conscious leadership practices I teach the women I work with is this. When you feel a rush of emotion, it could be anger, irritation, frustration, what we need to do is pause and notice with curiosity what's going on. And the best way to do that is just take 3 breaths. And when you do so, you're going to be more likely to respond with wisdom than react in a way that could cause harm. So as I'm working with our participants, I often ask them to share any stories they have from how these things are working for them in their own lives. And one day, a woman raised her hand, and she said to me, "Before I came to class yesterday, I cleaned up my whole house. And when I went home, my kids had messed up everything, and I was furious. Usually, I just beat my children. But today, I remembered what you said. And I closed my eyes, and I took 3 breaths, and I realized I don't really want to beat my children. I just want them to clean up the house." So I was able to stand there and to say, "This is why I want you to clean the house. You better do this right now. I'm standing here with my eyes closed." And you know what? They did. And I didn't have to beat my children today. So not only was that amazing in and of itself, but this woman was working on a social venture that was dealing with domestic violence. And so this single moment of mindfulness transformed not only how this one mother was raising her own children, but the way that she was going to approach her social venture work with couples in not only dealing with the conflict between themselves, but how they were raising their children, especially their boys. Conscious social change begins from within. The second principle of conscious social change is become whole. So in addition to noticing and the contemplative, mindful reflection that we're talking about, sometimes we have to be even more proactive and go in and work on our own stuff that might distort our work in the world. The unexamined self has been at the root of many an activist movement that has turned violent, or leadership that has been gained or sustained through oppression. So how do we practice becoming whole? We start with this same guiding question again. What is happening now? And once we notice and pause with curiosity, we can ask our second guiding question. What is needed? And we can discern what is our stuff that we need to attend to. Once we begin to work on our own unconscious patterns, we might actually notice change is really hard. And that ultimately may lead to a little more patience and compassion for those that we're always trying to change. The third principle is to ensure balance. Now, I have seen burnout 1,000 times among the international aid workers, development professionals, and first responders that I've worked with around the world. In the Darfur refugee camps of eastern Chad, people were so fed up with their inability to make a difference in the genocide, or feeling so overwhelmed by the suffering they were experiencing, they were quitting their posts within 6 months. Other places on the front lines, people would soothe their anxiety and stress through alcohol, or for others, it would lead down a long road towards illness, chronic fatigue, secondary post-traumatic stress, or even suicide. So self-care and ensuring balance is critical, not only for ourselves who are in the service world, but as a model for those who we aim to serve. Global Grassroots works with vulnerable women who are survivors of genocide, of other forms of war, of sexual violence and other gender-based violence crimes. And what we've seen is the symptoms of post-traumatic stress that they experience, including inability to plan for the future, distrust and disconnection and self-doubt, make it almost impossible for them to lead their own social entrepreneurship organizations without an investment in self-care. So how do we practice ensuring balance? We start again asking, what is happening now? And with presence, we're more likely to recognize when we are employing negative coping mechanisms to deal with our stress as a signpost. And then we can ask, all right, what is really needed here? And we can create a self-care plan that will nourish our minds, hearts, and bodies to enable our own renewal. The fourth principle is to stay attuned. Now, conventional change too often works from a paradigm of us versus them. We're trying to compel or force people to change with punitive measures or incentives, sometimes even demonizing our opposition. Just look at politics. And even in my field, there's a lot of talk of empowerment. But empowerment still implies something that I'm doing to you. I'm empowering you. You see, we need to shift away from models that perpetuate division and instead invest more mindfulness in understanding and engaging on more of an equal level. So how do we practice staying attuned? In this realm, we apply the same questions we did on an individual level, but we're looking now within a larger ecosystem, driving change from within the group. So we work collaboratively and inclusively to ensure every stakeholder has an opportunity to help answer the question, what is happening right now, as we diagnose the social issue. Then collectively, we look at what is really needed, and we define the vision and design an intervention that's going to be responsive and stay attuned. We're not getting too attached to a particular program and arbitrarily measuring our success with an increasing scale of outputs. Instead, we're really looking at how to get to the underlying issue here and solving it so that we ultimately put ourselves out of business. Then we get to our third guiding question. What do we know to be true? Conscious social change honors and embraces that every individual has insight from their particular life circumstances and a contribution that is valuable to the whole. And so with our fourth guiding question, what is helpful, we work together to leverage all of the assets of all parties to come up with the optimal solution. In so doing, conscious social change allows for the most effective and innovative ideas to step forward, and it's more sustainable because of its informed, inclusive, responsive, and creative nature. All right, so what does this look like in practice? Let me tell you about one of Global Grassroots' ventures in Rwanda. In a rural community outside of the capital city of Kigali, a group of 19 women who called themselves hard workers were very concerned about the long distance women had to travel to go and collect water about 3 miles down a hill to collect water out of a contaminated creek and then walk it all the way back up the hill again. So in addition to waterborne disease, other difficulties presented themselves. For women who are pregnant, elderly, sick, or disabled from the war, they really couldn't make that journey by themselves. Now, they could ask their girls to go collect water, but that would mean girls don't get to go to school. Others could pay men to bring water on a bicycle, but if they couldn't afford to pay for it, unfortunately, every day some of these most vulnerable women were being forced to trade sex to get water for their basic needs. So this particular group of 19 women went through our program, the Academy for Conscious Change, and with our training and just a $2,600 seed grant, they built their own water venture of their own design. They put these 2 tanks right next to a church so they could collect and purify rainwater off of the roof. And they would sell it to those who could afford to pay so that they could give it away for free to the vulnerable women who had been exploited. They started serving 100 households. Over time, they, because they were a nonprofit project, began reinvesting their profits back into the local community and decided they needed to pay for orphans' school fees and then vulnerable women's health insurance. And now that women were freed up for other economic pursuits because they weren't spending all day collecting water, they started a microcredit revolving loan fund and helped women start new businesses. Gender relations started changing as men asked to help with the project. And people started coming from 3 hours away to see how they were doing this themselves. Then they started talking on national radio about it. Well, 5 years since they started, they're fully sustainable. They've expanded to 3 new sites, and they are serving 6,000 people. But what is most amazing about hard workers is of these 19 women, only 7 of them know how to read. And they are now seen as the community leaders in their village. This is conscious social change. It comes from within the individual as well as the larger ecosystem. Our final principle is leading from within. The more that you cultivate presence, the more likely you are going to be able to identify your unique purpose. And the guiding question here is, what is possible? Well, I want to tell you about someone who's been a great inspiration for me. This is Adam Musa. He's a Darfur refugee who I met in 2005 in Konungo refugee camp for Darfuri survivors of the genocide in eastern Chad. And he's a passionate educator. And so despite the difficulties of living in a refugee camp, he saw opportunity. Adam dreamed of building a human rights library in the middle of this camp of 15,000 people. And it hinged on a single light bulb. So there's no power in the camp. So if you could just get one light bulb working, you'd be certain to have people after dark come and try and figure out what in the world's going on here. And he thought, if they would come, I could give lectures on what I call the bad, as what he called the bad habits of his community, including child abuse, female circumcision, and domestic violence. And if they came to hear a lecture, perhaps they'd learn that there's so much more to learn about. In fact, this is largely an illiterate farming community, the Darfuri population in his camp. And so for many of us, this would be a really nice dream, okay, but you're in a refugee camp, how are you going to do this? But for Adam, he was committed to making this a reality. So he found volunteers, and he asked them to donate some of their water rations. This is a water line. This is where refugees wait for their water each day. And they fill up that bucket, and that's what they use to drink and cook and clean and wash with for their whole family. But he convinced them to let him use some of their water, and he dug a hole and he poured the water into the hole, and he began to make mud and formed it into these mud bricks. And he began building his human rights library brick by brick with his own bare hands. People like Adam, who are driven by this inner sense of purpose, simply won't stop until they know they've made a difference. And in so doing, they inspire collective action. I mean, what do you think it must have taken to convince illiterate refugees to donate scarce water rations in a 109-degree desert to build a library? This is conscious social change that comes from within. So how do we practice this? Well, we ask our first question, what do I know to be true? You identify your inner passions, and we all know what that is. What energizes us, what are we really good at, what excites us. But it's our responsibility to cultivate it and offer it back for the sake of the common good. And then, in addition to our inner resources, we look at leveraging our outer assets. So let me tell you a quick story about what I mean by this. Global Grassroots has another venture in Rwanda that has been working on teaching 1,300 women how to read. Now, these women were too poor to afford to pay for their training, but the venture still needed to find a way to pay its teachers' salaries. So they used one of our teachings about leveraging waste, and they looked around and they saw there were a lot of rocks lying around, and a lot of sticks and some broken bricks. So they thought, these are assets. And they said to the women, instead of paying a fee, when you come to your training each day, we want you to bring a rock, a brick, or a stick with you and put it in this pile. That'll be your fee. Well, after 2 weeks, they had enough broken bricks and rocks to fill a dump truck, and they sold it to a construction company as building supplies, and they bundled the sticks and they sold it as firewood, and they made enough money to pay their teachers' salaries for several weeks. See, presence brings a fresh perspective to what is possible, what is truly possible. Whether your tool is a rock, a Kleenex, or your own bare hands. So now I turn these questions back to you. What do you need? What do you really yearn to do in this world? What do you know to be true? What is your unique wisdom? And what is possible? Go within, lead with presence, and you will create conscious social change.